Would you please join me in welcoming Rosemary Nidal Greenlee?
Thank you, Bill. This panel is going to talk about medicine and treatment behind the lines and on the battlefield. This is a little different from some of the other panels you maybe will have been hearing from. So be ready. Every soldier, every parent, every spouse knows the importance of good medical care for a soldier if he becomes a casualty of war. We are here today to learn the experience, to hear the experiences of people who have personally faced the challenge of providing that care, and actually from one person who was a patient after he was hit. As a former Navy nurse, a retired VA nurse, and the co-author of 3 books on military nursing during World War II, I can tell you how important timely, effective care is for those who have been hurt or are ill during a war. Had it not been for nurses, as some of these, the physicians, the corpsmen, who covered the globe in our global World War II, some of the people at this reunion might not have been here, let alone the offspring of some of those folks. Our panelists are eyewitnesses and participants in the mission of caring for the wounded in this worldwide conflagration. Now, I know that there are bios that have been passed around, so I'm not going to go into long detail regarding our participants, but I will tell a little about them. I would like to sort of set the tone for this panel. On December the 7th, 1941, the United States was jolted into the reality of war. But how prepared were we to care for our sick and wounded? From today's standards of medical care, going to war without antibiotics and without a plan to get whole blood to our wounded is unthinkable. It is our purpose on this panel to discuss how medical treatment was performed on the front lines and behind the lines of World War II. Now, in 1942, the war against Germany was focused in North Africa when the British had been fighting Rommel. And we knew enough not to do a cross-channel invasion yet because we certainly weren't ready. The pressure, however, was on the United States to take decisive action since we'd been attacked at Pearl Harbor. On 8 November 1942, the U.S. launched Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, where inexperienced hospital units followed the troops through the deserts of Algeria and North Africa and Tunisia. After the surrender of the Germans on May 1943 in North Africa, Operation Husky cleared Sicily of the enemy by 17 August 1943. As soon as Sicily was cleared, the United States moved in dug in airfields and other bases on the island. One of those recently established airfields on Sicily was Catania, Maine, on the East Coast, and it became the home of the 807th Medical Evacuation Squadron and 2nd Lieutenant Agnes Jensen, who is with us today. Her last name is Mandrich now. And so in the fall of 1943, this 807th Medical Evac was put in place there, and they were getting ready to pick up wounded in various parts of the Mediterranean theater of war. Agnes, you tell us some things about what it was like to be a flight nurse in those days. Now, she'd gone through flight training in Bowmanfield, Kentucky, and then was stationed on Sicily. Can you tell us something about that?
Oh,
Yes, ma'am.
You were finished. Being a flight nurse, of course, was entirely different than working in a hospital. You had a stable ground, the first place to stand on, and the patients were somewhat different. In my case, we were evacuating Italy And there's very few airplanes. We come in sometimes, and maybe there'd be no airplanes, and maybe there'd be lots of patients. Maybe there'd be patients and no airplanes. So we played it by ear all the way. And I was there a very short time because of other circumstances. I was on my third flight, actually, because having had a round with dysentery and so forth for about 10 days, and I went back to work, and I got on this plane with 12 other flight nurses and 12 of our surgical techs and a crew of 4 and a C-47, and we took off, headed for Bari, Italy, pick up patients. It was a flight of about an hour and a half, and just about the time we arrived over Bari, according to the pilots later, the radio quit. So we were strictly on our own. It was a very heavy cloud cover, so they didn't want to go down through it, I guess, and luckily they didn't. And so they flew around, and finally lost their way, I think, or lost track of where they were. And we flew around till we found a level place to put the airplane down, and it was on the side of a mountain, but we didn't know it was also a piece of German-occupied Albania. And we landed. The nose of the plane, before they got stopped, was in the muddy end of a lake. And we all got out safely and walked. The plane was right on the ground. We could walk out. And the only reason we weren't shot down, according to the natives later, was because one young Albanian boy said, no, this is not German, not British, this is American, it has a star on it. And he said, otherwise, he was telling us later, you would have been shot, is what they intended to do, one by one, if you stepped out of the airplane. So that was our first escapade, more or less, and from there on, it only got better or worse as the days went on. And we were immediately taken in. Oh, they shook our hands. They were so happy. And as near as I could hear, they were saying, Amerigo, Amerigo. And so we followed them like little sheep following their mama. And they took us to their home or to a place. Actually, I think it was their headquarters for their operations, and we stayed there overnight. And it was a stone house with slate roof, and it was raining just a little, just enough to get our uniforms nicely wet in the long, tall weeds as we walked about 2 hours to the house. And then we sat down around a fire. There was an open fire it wasn't a fireplace, it was a fire box. That's all they had in those houses. Very smoky house. Lots of window and door leaks, so we couldn't suffocate. But we sat there and talked to one another. Where are we now? How can we get out of here? What's Albania near us to? And somebody mentioned Turkey, and they said, well, that's neutral. Let's try that. We thought we could walk any direction we wanted, but we weren't thinking about. There were quite a few Germans in there already, and along with another side of the Albanians who were sympathetic to the Germans, we'd best wait and stay with them, which we did a couple of days. And mainly when they got ready to take us someplace, well, it was a little bit too late that night. The Germans decided to take that town. And so, did I not? No. So we woke up in the morning to gunfire, and we didn't know which way to go. So we ran out the door, and some of us ran down the way and find the pilots. And they said, well, they're in a hotel down here on the main road. Well, there's only one main road, and we knew we came in one way. We passed the German installation as we came in, so we knew enough to go the other way. And we kept running along, getting up higher in the hills. And the truck came along and tried to pick us up. And we got on it, and we rode a ways. And then pretty soon we saw airplanes overhead, and they were yelling, "Stuka, Stukas." So we jumped off this truck, and it was terribly high, and ran and tried to hide. About the time we all got off the truck, well, of course, they were gone, so we got back on. We did that a couple of trips, and the co-pilot said, let's get off this yellow thing on this main road and climb up this bank and crawl under these bushes, which we did. We thought everybody on the truck had done this, but they hadn't. It was just a handful of us. And so the rest had stayed on the truck, and they went elsewhere. And that night we began to count our numbers again and see where we should go, how we should go. The one man wanted to take us. The rest of the family evidently didn't want us at all. It was a little bit too near Berat for them. And so they tried to keep us out, and finally they decided, well, they'd let us stay. And they got us up very early the next morning before daylight to get us on our way again. And we just followed on mountain trails. We didn't know exactly where we were going. They'd just say, come on, and swing their arm, and we'd follow them. And the next, that night we stayed with this one house anyway. We never saw anything really resembled family. They never gave us a drink of water, a bit of food. We hadn't eaten since Sunday noon, and this was Monday night. And so finally we laid down around the fire and went to sleep. And somebody woke up rather early in the morning, so we all got up and bailed out and see if we could run. We were sure we were on the trail of the other bunch. We wanted to chase them before they got away. And we went down this trail and followed for a ways, and we didn't. But when we stayed that night at the house, that one man said, American people stayed here last night. So we said, we're on their trail. So we didn't want to stay. We said, let's just take off. Let's say, and chase them before they get too far away. But bless his heart, he wouldn't let us. He said the trail was very bad, very tricky, and he indicated as if there were animals that would nip at our feet and legs. And so when he didn't want us in the first place, when he heard us saying this, he opened up the door and said, go in, lie down. We'd lay down by the fire again, no food, no water. And not that they were inhospitable, but I don't think they thought about us for all the other activities that were going on. And so somebody woke up very early the next morning, and we all took off, and we did catch on to our group. And we did find the one English-speaking Albanian who we had been talking to in Berat, and we were glad to see him. And he stayed with us. His name was Kostic Stefa. And he stayed with us almost the end of our trail until we got out. And bless his heart, he interpreted and kept us on the straight and narrow. However, he told us, I think maybe a few days later, we met up with all our crew, and we decided to write a note. He said he heard, and I'm sure he knew, but he was about to say it, that there were British in the country. So we said, well, let's write a note, and he said maybe we could send a runner. So we wrote a note, and he instructed the runner to find the British and bring a message back to us. So there were high points and very low points as we went along. We were either at the edge of disaster or we were on top of the world. Well, as we kept running along and getting into more or less trouble, we finally got to a place where we were going to go around this mountain, but somebody gave us a warning that the opposite faction, those who were sympathetic to the Germans, would be waiting for us, not for the Americans necessarily, but for the bunch that were leading us. So then they had to go find somebody that knew more about the trails up on top of that mountain. And so we waited a couple hours and finally started. Well, it was cold, and our shoes were nearly always damp or wet, and mine certainly were that day. And we started out in just a very little sprinkling snow, but by the time we got to the top of the mountain, there was a raging blizzard, and we couldn't see a foot in front of us. We couldn't see a foot track. And I thought, well, what difference did it make if we had someone who knew the trail? How can they see anything? Well, I don't think they could, but they kept going along, and we followed them. And when is this water? I want some. When we finally we couldn't talk to one another. The blizzard was so bad, and howling wind, and the snow swirling around us, and our foot tracks were covered up as soon as we took our foot out of it. I was thinking, how are they going to tell where we are? I'd been in such storms in northern Minnesota as a child, but I never saw anything like this. And as we followed down the trail a ways, they finally, as we walked, I don't know how far, I guessed 30 minutes maybe we were in that, or 35 minutes. 35 minutes more would have been too much. And we were just frozen. My hands were like stubs, and we nurses had our trench coats and hats and scarves and things, but the men had their little summer jackets, because it was nice in Sicily that morning when we started. And
Mrs. Mandrich?
but it was raining, so we put our storm coats on.
Would you mention one way that some of the people who were hurt traveled when you were there with the mules?
Pardon me?
Would you mention about the mules and how you had to put people on the backs?
Now and again we'd have a mule or a donkey to have a little ride on. And if we got more than one, two of them, sometimes they'd balk and not decide they had too big a load, and they'd just kind of kneel down or lie down. And so we'd have to get off and start all over, unload the mules.
I wanted her to mention the mules because in very rocky Sicily and Italy, mules were used to bring in ammunition and food and to haul out the wounded. I don't think a lot of people understand that. In some of this rocky terrain, these critters were very important to us.
I don't know what you said.
Yeah, I was just talking about the mules. I want to just wrap up Agnes's session by saying that President Roosevelt monitored their progress as they were trying to make their way through 800 miles of winter trails in Albania in November and December. And this is a really unusual kind of story that it's hard to deviate from, but I want to move on to some of the other panel members. Mrs. Mandrich, her story's been told in a book that she will have tomorrow, I believe Bill said here, and it's a very exciting story. You've just heard little pieces of it from her. Thank you very much. Meanwhile, in the United States, men were being drafted into the military and women volunteered to serve. Each state in the United States had a quota of nurses that they had to come up with for the Army and Navy nurse corps. However, there was one group of nurses that were a great possibility, but because of the pressures and prejudices of the time, they were overlooked. These were the Negro nurses who had been turned away from the recruiting offices then. And we have Margaret Bailey with us today, and if they had known that Margaret Bailey was destined to be the first lieutenant colonel black woman in the military and then the first colonel, they would have taken her in a lot sooner. But she literally had to fight for the right to get into the military. Margaret, would you tell us more about that?
Yes. First, I would like to congratulate those nurses who were behind the lines and anyone who was behind the lines, because that is where I wanted to be. However, in 1941, they asked for nurses to join the military, and of course, all of the nurses applied. Black nurses applied. But they were told there was no regulation that would permit them to let us in. And so we went back. They didn't realize the power of women. Mrs. Roosevelt, Congresswoman from Colorado, all of the nurses' organizations made beelines to the Surgeon General office to say, you must let these women in. And I think they went back so many times until he said, well, I'll take 54 and no more. And this is my version, and I think he said, I don't want these women anymore coming up to my office. And so he did let 54 black nurses in. However, they were told that they could only take care of black soldiers. Well, that was another blow. And those nurses stayed at Fort Huachuca for the longest time, and the 92nd and the 93rd Division of black soldiers were at Fort Huachuca, and we took care of the black soldiers. And we said, that's fine, we know you're going to get some good nursing care. And they did. Well, here we were. There were quite a few black nurses at Fort Huachuca, and they said, well, now, what are we going to do? I'm sure they said, what are we going to do with these nurses now? We have no more black soldiers. And you know that we had prisoners of war, Italians and Germans. The Italians had rejoined us. The German soldiers were still there. And since the black nurses were totally segregated, hospitals, they ran the hospitals, and there was a unit, and they sent us to Florence, Arizona, to take care of the German prisoners of war. And I think today that probably sounds very good, but the Germans were very kind, and we didn't have lots of trouble, and they said, we wanted to be captured by the Americans because we knew we would get good care, and they did get good care. Shall I say, we were 6 months or a year, and I want to tell you that Florence, Arizona, the only nice thing about it was that you stood in the middle of a knoll and watched that beautiful sunset. It just took you by surprise. We loved that. The rest we didn't. And we, after the prisoner of war camps, we went along, I think, to another camp where they were training soldiers. We lived separately, but at that time, we were allowed to work integrated because they had integrated soldiers. And I think black nurses were segregated for quite a number of years. But 1950, in the 50s, we were still segregated. But we took this because we also wanted to contribute to our country, and we did. And fortunately, when they said the Army is now integrated, and I believe Mr. Truman was the one who said, we'll have no more of this, we gradually became a part of the United States Army. And it's interesting. You know, it wasn't so difficult. People were very happy to have us. Nurses were wonderful, and we could have gone overseas and we could have functioned quite well. But I think there was a fear of the government that this would not be well. But I'm very pleased with the service that I was able to render to the soldiers in general. I'm very pleased to have had the privilege, and I have spent 27 years in the military and made some very wonderful friends. Congratulations to all of you folks.
Thank you, Colonel Bailey. While Agnes Jensen Mandrich was training Army flight nurses back at Bowman Field, Kentucky after she got out of Albania, and Margaret Bailey was fighting for the right to serve. The United States military in the Mediterranean theater of war had entered Rome. In England, 150,000 Allied troops were waiting to go across the channel on 700 ships and over 4,000 landing craft, all poised at the edge of the English Channel in Normandy, France. Harold Baumgarten was one of those thousands of soldiers. Dr. Baumgarten, would you tell us about that? And I will say he wasn't Dr. Baumgarten then. He was a 19-year-old soldier who later got his medical
Right. I was not an MD in World War II, but I had a lot of medical experience. My outfit, the 1st Battalion, 116th Infantry of the 29th Division, was chosen to hit the most heavily defended beach on Omaha Beach, the Dog Green sector, the beach that was shown in Saving Private Ryan and The Longest Day. And they knew that being combat assault troops, we wouldn't have any medical attention. So the battalion surgeon, for the first time, the first aid kits contained their own individual morphine sulfate, 1 grain, in a little miniature toothpaste tube called a Surette with a built-in hypodermic needle. Battalion surgeon told us how to break the seal and inject it under any part of your skin to relieve you of pain. This was never used again for individual soldiers by the United States Army because they had fear of drug abuse. The only thing we were interested in is women and wine and song, but they didn't do it anymore. And now they also issued a couple little maroon capsules. These later became known as Dramamine, with 3 barf bags. So this was, it was about 50% effective for the seasickness in these 20-foot waves that we were going to go in tiny assault boats, smaller than the LCVP in the Louisiana Pavilion. But they didn't tell us that you're not supposed to take aspirins if you're going to get wounded. I took 2 aspirins at 9 o'clock on June 5th, and it caused a lot of bleeding. Now, what I'm going to tell you about today, I'm going to skip a lot of the gory things of these dead bodies on the beach, and we lost 150 in drowning, and ships blew up, and tanks sunk. I'm going to mostly tell you about the deficiencies in medicine and medical treatment in World War II, especially for assault troops. So I'm going to start out with, I had to cross 400 yards of open beach, and I hate to tell you that for a 19-year-old to see what I saw with body parts laying around and a wounded man with guts hanging out, and it was horrible. And they got no treatment, and the tide was very treacherous, an inch a minute. If they couldn't get off that beach, they drowned or got washed out in the English Channel. Now, I finally got, there was one covering place on the beach. It was a 25-foot cement seawall, which it's still there today, which tails away from you as you're going at a 45-degree angle with loose shale rocks on it. So our aim was to get to that cover, because the Air Force was supposed to give us man-made foxholes, but they goofed. So when I got to 120 yards from that seawall, I received my first wound. I was looking to the right at a huge pillbox, and I got hit with a fragment of an 88 millimeter shell, which ripped off this cheek over my ear, took away my left upper jaw, put a hole in the roof of my mouth, and I had teeth and gums laying on my tongue. I washed out my face in 3 inches of dirty English Channel water, and I swung my face over to the front, and Bedford Holback of Bedford, Virginia, one of the Bedford boys, was hit straight in in the face by a fragment of the same shell, and he died immediately. I was surrounded by dead bodies, and I decided I better get off that beach. When I reached the seawall, there was a fellow named Dominic Suro of Company A, not a scratch on him. And we had to go down to our rendezvous, was to the east part of the beach, in an area called D1, which was the road going up into France. So I followed him, and all of a sudden I heard a clunk. A sniper shot him through the head. And he was bigger than me. I was 185 pounds and 5'10". I shrunk a little. I won't tell you why. But anyway, so he died. I got down to the rendezvous area, and my best buddy was lying face down in the sand. Now, this was about 7:15, and up on this seawall, protecting themselves, was 4 wounded friends of mine from Company A, and one on my right died within 10 minutes because he had a severe face wound. Now, we didn't have any medical attention. So about 100 yards to the east, a boat landed with Captain Robert Ware, who was the battalion surgeon. He was against orders landing. He was a fellow from Virginia. He landed with 3 combat medical soldiers. 3 of them got killed, shot right through the head by snipers. Only 1 survived. He came down the beach and he leaned over me with all the shells coming down. The greatest hero of D-Day, Cecil Breeden of Deer Trail, Colorado. And he put sulfur powder in my face, wound. He pulled my cheek back in place. He made me swallow 12 sulfur tablets. That was the routine in those days. And I think he gave me a little morphine, so I got a little fuzzy-headed for a while. And then I never saw him again. But that was the initial treatment. He put a bandage on that stayed on from my entire combat, which was a day and a half. And at 10 o'clock, I looked out on the beach, which was being shelled by mortar shells, machine gun fire, all kinds of artillery shells. And I saw Sergeant John Fraser laying there, and he couldn't move. Both legs had been shattered. So I ran out instinctively to get him. And as I kneeled over him, I got 3 pieces of a mortar shell right through my helmet, into my skull, and the blood came down my ear and the back of my neck. And I put his right hand over my shoulder, and I crawled with him to the seawall, put him behind the wall. He's still alive today. Now, about 11 o'clock, I looked out on the beach, and there was 6 combat medics of the Company B of the 104th Medical. And they were treating about 30 wounded soldiers with IVs, suturing. They were under sniper fire, even though they had Red Crosses on their helmets. They were under the command of Dr. Joseph Shelley of St. Augustine, Florida, who's still alive. Anyway, they told us, the walking wounded, the ambulatory, they said, why don't you run down the beach to St. Laurent-sur-Mer, that's about where the American Cemetery is today, and we'll evacuate you. But we got together and we decided, we saw all our dead buddies, we weren't going to surrender that beach to the Germans. So we became the walking wounded, 12 of us. We went up the cement seawall, we went up the 100-foot bluff, we turned towards the west, and we took on 2 German positions. And we were very successful, but by 5 o'clock that afternoon, there were only 7 of us left. We got up to the top of the bluff, we crossed the beach road to a big hedgerow. We figured that was going to be a safe place for us. Meanwhile, we didn't see any more 29th Division people. We were all alone, 7 of us. We crawled up to this hedgerow, and I felt a stinging feeling in my left foot. And when I got against the hedgerow, I was shot by a castrator mine. Instead of the bullet going between my legs, it went between my toes, and I had a hole in the top of my shoe and in my legging. I pulled off the shoe and I dumped the blood out like water from a vase. I pulled off my sock. I put on a beautiful bandage with sulfur powder, and just then shells came in. And I dove for the safety. I pulled the shoe up with the bandage off and dove for safety behind the hedgerow. Now, I had had my big toe split in half. My second metatarsal was gone. My third metatarsal was a compound fracture. Now, we stayed there until 12:30 in the morning because we felt safe. But all of a sudden, a lot of shells came in. So we decided we'd cross the road to a big ditch on the other side of on the northern side of the Beach Road. Beach Road runs east and west, runs all the way to Pont de Hoc, where the Rangers landed. That was our mission, to free those Rangers. We never reached it. Anyway, as we crossed the road, there was a machine gun 50 meters down the road to the west, and we were ambushed. So my buddies were all mortally wounded. I dragged behind because of the foot. I don't know how I was able to walk, but when I finally got to the ditch, I fell on top of two of them. The only wound I got then, and that was 12:30 in the morning on June 7th, was a bullet through the cheek again, which took away a piece of my lip and this upper jaw. So there I was laying at 12:30 in the morning. These fellows were moaning and finally died. There were 3 German planes going over us at low altitude. In fact, I covered my watch, which was a luminous dial, which was kind of silly to do. That watch is up on the 3rd floor in a glass case, still functioning today. That's how I know all the times that was going on. Anyway, I thought we lost the battle. I gave myself a big shot of morphine. I was in pain right here in my hand. And I went to sleep until about 3 in the morning. And I looked out at the west part of that highway, and coming down the road was an American ambulance. Either it was a mirage, but it was silhouetted against this huge moon. And I decided, how was I going to stop them? I couldn't talk. The jaws were gone. Teeth and gums were still laying on my tongue, and I had a hole in the roof of the mouth. So how was I going to stop them? I picked up a submachine gun from a ranger that was one of our walking wounded, and I fired over the top of the ambulance. 2 frightened GIs came out, and they sized up the situation, and they said, "Can you sit up in the ambulance?" Which I thought was kind of silly at the time, but I found out that it was stacked with wounded. They had been fighting ahead of us while I was in my morphine sleep. So anyway, as they lifted me up, I remembered the blood coming down my uniform, not only from my blood, the blood of the people underneath me. They took us down to St. Laurent-sur-Mer on the sand. They put us out in stretchers, 12 of us. And they had 2 Army medical corpsmen, each with a Red Cross armband. And they gave us blankets, water, and they gave us morphine every 4 hours with a tag around our neck, tagging the time that they gave it so they wouldn't give us an overdose. Now at 11 o'clock, there were snipers up in the bluff, and they opened up at the combat medics. They shot them right through the Red Cross, so they had telescopic sights. They were killing the wounded. When they came to me, they shot me in the right knee. So that was wound number 5 on June 7th. Now, at 3 p.m., I was evacuated to LST 291. And I figured, great, I'm going to go back to England. They're going to take care of me. They took me to a little operating room with a Navy doctor in there, stripped off all my bloody clothes, threw it in the garbage. They tried to get my watch, but I covered it, so it's still in this museum. And I had plasma going in this arm, a glucose drip going in my mouth, and the doctor put 2 sutures in my knee because it was pumping blood. I was turned over to everything was left open, the cheek, the teeth and gums on my tongue, the hole in the roof of the mouth. I was turned over to a Navy corpsman who gave me royal treatment. He gave me clear soups, Dole pineapple juice, morphine, and penicillin every 4 hours. Now that sounds great, penicillin every 4 hours. But penicillin does not touch a battlefield wound. So, and when I drank the soup and the Dole pineapple juice, it was coming out my left nostril. They took me to Portsmouth June 11th. That was 5 days after my initial wound. So you can see in Iraq, a soldier that's wounded is 17 minutes back to a field hospital with full surgical procedures. So you can see where we were deficient in World War II. Now, the reason it took them till June 11th, they had to land equipment, and the equipment came first. And they hit a mine, and the propeller was half blown off. So we had to limp back to England. There, they took me to a British Royal Navy hospital where the doctors were shocked. After they did lab work and x-rays, they looked at my foot, which was covered with green pus, bright green, shiny, which was Piocyaneus or Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is a gram-negative bacteria which is not touched by penicillin. So they took me to surgery. I figured they're going to lop off my foot, but they pieced each bone together, put me in a bird cage with a big full-head cast. They took the teeth and gums off my tongue, which was a relief, but I still had the hole in the roof of the mouth. The British nurses were excellent. I left there on June 24th to a 250th Station Hospital, U.S. hospital, and they took me with, incidentally, the British used chloroform for anesthesia. When I got to the American hospital, they used sodium pentothal. They sewed up my face originally, sewed up my lip, and I stayed there. Excellent nursing. U.S. nurses were great. They took me on July 4th to the 258th General Hospital in Salisbury, England, where they had to take my cast off because there was green pus coming out of my foot. And they had me soak in potassium permanganate 3 times a day. Finally, they put the cast back on. They were unsuccessful to kill the infection. Battlefield infections are hard to cure. Now they have gram-negative antibiotics that they use on the soldiers. I still had the hole in the roof of the mouth. They flew me back to the United States by way of Scotland, Iceland, Newfoundland, and they took me to Cushing General Hospital, Framingham, Massachusetts, which was a plastic surgery center. But we were too emaciated to operate on. I had lost 75 pounds. So I was down to 110 pounds. But by October, they had fattened me up. They gave me beer, chopped, ground up meat, and the nursing was excellent. Anyway, they operated on me and sewed up the hole in the roof of the mouth in October. November, I had plastic surgery, and you can see the job they did. They put steel plates in to replace the jaws, and but by January 45, I first got rid of the pus from my foot. February, I begged them to discharge me so I could go back to New York University, back to my studies. I had had 2 years of college. When I was 18, I joined them, the 29th. So they made me promise that I would go to a VA facility, which I did. In between semesters, I was getting operated on. And this went on up to the present. I've had 22 operations. The last one was August 2006, a bone implant up here in the roof of the mouth at the Gainesville, Florida VA. And that's the end of my story.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Baumgarten. What a great illustration and description of what happens on the beach. Meantime, back in England, we'll jump back to just pre-D-Day. There had been a prototype hospital that had been in Tunisia and in the Mediterranean theater that really was a prototype when the war started. Well, they came back to England as the experts then on how to conduct hospitals under canvas, etc. and this was the 48th Surgical Hospital. And it was located in England, and as every new hospital came from the United States into Britain, they all came through that 48th Surgical to get training that they needed and to hear the real nitty-gritty on how it was out in the field. And I think one of those hospitals was probably the 187th General Hospital, where Virginia Schuler-Visser was an Army nurse. And I'll say that Virginia was a young Army nurse because she graduated in, 1943 and went to war in it was January of 1944. So Virginia, tell us what it was like there in England.
Thank you. You can see why I'm so proud to be an Army nurse and was an Army nurse. And it's great to hear the stories, and there were so many of them. When I spoke the other day, when I ended, I had graduated from nurses training. I had taken state board, but you had to pass your state board before you could be accepted in the Army. And so those waiting days were very, very frightening, but I passed state board, no problem, and entered the service in December, actually, of 1943. And I reported to Camp Carson, Colorado, and then we were there 8 weeks. I was stationed there in the hospital, and the first patients that had seen combat or been in the combat zone were some of the ski troopers that were in Alaska that came down. And we treated those guys. They'd been up there a year or two in the dark, you know, it was wintertime when they got back. So there were a lot of psychiatric problems that developed during that time. I stayed in Camp Carson, and I received within 8 weeks, I had orders to go overseas. And that's a pretty fast movement. I wanted to go overseas, but I wasn't sure I wanted to go that quickly. But we left Camp Carson, traveled by train, went to Longview, Texas, and there the 187th Hospital developed. And there were 80 nurses in the group, and we were there 12 days, and we were set up, the hospital was ready to go, a full general hospital. And we were loaded on trains, troop trains, and we had no idea where we were going, but I was very pleased to see that we were headed east. My geography had taught me that, because I don't think I would have functioned so well in the South Pacific. I don't like bugs and I don't like heat, so they sent me in the right direction. And we were on sea 12 days, and I was seasick every single day after we got out of port. But I did survive. We got to England, and we landed in Liverpool. We were held there for a day, and it was there when, at the evening, when they took us off of the boats and the ships. And it was a most eerie feeling, because for the first time we realized that we were in a war zone. And they held us on the ship till night, and we marched through those cobblestone streets at late night, and you heard not a sound except the clumping of the boots moving along. And they took us to trains, and we went to Swindon, England. And our hospital, the 187th, hadn't been set up in. It was partially built, but it wasn't ready for the nurses and the doctors to be assigned there. So we were billeted with English families, which we were in Swindon. And Bonita Schenker, one of the other nurses, and I were with a wonderful, wonderful English family. And we were there with them for 12 days. And it was really a great introduction. These people had suffered war for several years, and it made us realize as Americans that we were coming there. We were no longer as cocky as we had been when we first arrived. And when we got set up in our hospital unit, and we were near Tidworth, England, and we got there, and we were all set up waiting for patients. And of course, we all know on D-Day, June 6th, we were there, and we hadn't been maybe a day when we started receiving patients. And these were burn patients, some of them. Some of them were gunshot wounds, of course. And we were initiated very quickly on how to deal with the patients. And I think the transition that we made at that time was remarkable, because it had been such a short time since we'd left the United States. And after D-Day, well, before D-Day, every morning we'd get up and we'd watch the planes come in, some of their engines feathered. We knew something was going to happen, but we didn't know when. So we worked and took care of the patients who were coming back. And on D-Day, it was announced in the morning, and I remember that very distinctly. And of course, we all gathered down in the mess hall to see what was going on. And the planes came over, and pretty soon we started realizing that the patients were coming back, that it was D-Day. And I stayed there. That August, I received word from the Red Cross that my brother had been hit. He was a B-17 pilot. And so I had permission, and I was very concerned about this because we were very, very busy. And the captain that was in our unit, one of the doctors, and I said, I really don't feel I should go. And he said, Lieutenant, he said, Captain Rose died last week, and he said they didn't stop the war, so I think we can spare you. So I went up to see my brother on the back of it, or not on the back, but in a laundry truck to get transportation to go. He was up in Norwich, England. So I spent 3 days with him before they sent him back to the States. It was about this time that fall that things were starting to let up in England. So they asked for 80 volunteer nurses to go to the continent. They needed some nurses for the evacuation hospitals. So Doris Thomas and I volunteered to go. And we went to England. We were held up there because you remember when Glenn Miller's plane went down. Well, we were in England that time. They got us up every morning at 5 o'clock. We'd go out to Heathrow, couldn't fly. They'd bring us back. All the clothes we had were what we had on our back. And we were billeted in a cold running water apartment building that had been bombed at some time. But we survived, and I think it was on about the 5th or 6th, maybe 7th day that we finally were able to fly out, and we got to Paris. We flew from London to Paris, and London was lit up, and they had white bread, and it was wonderful to be in Paris. Then we were assigned to the 36th General Hospital, which was near Dijon, and there I was assigned to a prisoner of war camp. And we had the Germans that were there, nice patients, very, docile individuals, very happy to be out of the war. And so during that time, and then our orders came that we were to go to join the 2nd Evacuation Hospital. And so we started out, and Doris Thomas and I, all we had was our orders, our transportation. We were to look at train, truck, whatever. So we took the train from Paris to Liège, Belgium, and we were terrified because here, when you're attached to an outfit or in the Army, there's certain security about that. You know your outfit's there, but we were on our own then. So we traveled, we went to Liège, Belgium, and when we got there, we kept asking, does anybody know where the 2nd evac is? And they said, no, they were here, but it was just so chaotic at that time. Everything was moving, and it was scary. So we would stay at hospitals. We went along the way. Finally, we got to Weimar, Germany. And when we were there, the captain that was the head of the 2nd Evacuation Hospital was in Naumburg. And they got in contact when we were in Weimar and said, stay there. She said, I'll be there to see you. And she looked at us and said, where have you been? Like we'd been in the Riviera, maybe. We'd been traveling for days. We were tired. But we had to stay over a day till they could come and pick us up. And while we were there, one of the GIs said, hey, would you like to go see a concentration camp? Well, we really had no idea what a concentration camp was. We hadn't heard that much about it because we'd been on the move. And so we said yes. And probably that was the most searing experience of the war. I had seen people die, I've seen people wounded, but to see what had happened and what was happening at Buchenwald. They had removed a number of the patients, but there were still some there. Some of the ovens were still, of course, they were still there. But I think the thing that probably shocked us the most was stepping out from where the crematorium was, or they were, because there were many of them, stepping out and then seeing all these bodies stacked out there. And almost instinctively, my friend, Doris Thomas, and I held hands, and I don't know why, but we just needed the comfort of one another because it was a most searing experience, that's all I can say. But then we went back the next day, and they picked us up, and we went to the 2nd Evacuation Hospital, which was in Weimar, which was not too far from Leipzig. We hadn't been there too long, and then the Russians had taken over that territory. Germany was divided up, the Russian, the French, and the American territory. And so we were in the Russian territory, and we had to move out of there. We moved to hospital and patients within 2 days. And we were moved back, and we were in tents and set up out in the country or out in the fields at Gießen, Germany. And we were still receiving patients. The war was starting to wind down, but we had lots and lots we were still receiving some casualties because the war hadn't stopped. And I think that all of you remember, well, the nurses that were there, when the patients were picked up out in the field, they had little charts that would list what the corpsmen had given them, or the medics had given them when they were picked up. And so it said, you know, they shot in the head, shot. We picked up one day when we were triaging patients, it said shot in the ass, and that's exactly where he was shot. But I functioned very, very well, and we moved on. Then from there, we were transferred to Stuttgart, Germany, and we shared a German hospital. All this time we were taking care of patients, burn patients. I think probably the burn patients were the most difficult to take care of. They had found that when some of the pilots were shot down over the channel, that they were healing much better if they'd been in saline. So saline water, salt water. And we were supposed to try and keep them with the burn. I think of the one, I can remember so clearly that his arms were burned. And we tried with that. We didn't have plastics. We didn't have, trying to keep saline solution and keep that moist was very, very difficult. It required almost one being there full time. But he eventually was shipped back to the States also. Then we went from there to Fulda, Germany, and we were also in an evacuation hospital. We were treating lots of patients with many things. I think probably one time when I had the most traumatic realization, I guess, of maybe war treating patients was when we were in Fulda, because you just realized that all these DPs were coming, displaced persons were coming through, and they were French, they were Dutch, they were German, not German, but Americans, and being treated that were coming through that had to be separated and found their home. I don't know how they ever were able to do that. I think the American Red Cross did a remarkable job at that time, getting these people back. You hope they all got back, because it was just tragic. We'd get some of the patients, they'd be so terrified, you'd try to treat them and they'd be clutching whatever small item they had, and they were frightened, and we couldn't speak their language in many cases. Sometimes we had interpreters that could speak several languages, but that wasn't too often. And then I was in Fulda. By the way, I met a very handsome captain, and I think it was when we were in Gießen. I know it was when we were in Gießen. But he came up, and John Visser was his name, and he came, when I was in Fulda, he came up to see me. He had gotten a leave, and he was up there a short time. And transportation was almost impossible. And so he left, and he was there. I was on night duty then, so he sat up, and all the patients loved to talk to one another, particularly somebody that had been in combat, which John had. And so we were there, and the next morning I got off duty, and he had to head back. He left about 10 o'clock, and at 12 o'clock that day, I received my orders that we were to be in Marseille, France, by the next day. Now, this is almost humanly impossible. We had 900 miles to drive to get back there. There were 8 of us that were on the road on the back of a 2.5-ton truck for 900 miles to get back to Marseille, France, which we did. We got there and we'd missed the boat. It had left the day before. So then we were assigned all sorts of, collecting money, making sure it could keep us busy because there was no hospital there. So we were there, and I think we were there probably maybe 10 days before we were able to get a boat to get back to the United States. And we sailed back, took 13 days, and we hit terrible storms. And I was as sick coming home as I was getting overseas. But I think through all this experience, and there are so many stories to tell and so forth, but I think that I developed a great appreciation for individuals and the courage. And I never saw one patient, and we saw lots of patients that were badly wounded, ever really complained. And usually the first question they asked, do you know where my outfit is? Do you know what happened to the rest of the guys? And of course we didn't, because everyone was separated. But I think the experience taught me caring, certainly, taught me an understanding, and I think my friends could all speak to that, and the fact that we were a part of something that was very important, and we did the very best job we knew how to do. Thank you. Thank you.
I want to thank these folks who have participated, and I will say, because I know how underspoken nurses are when you talk to them about their experiences. I was just doing my job, but every one of them has a story like Virginia. It's wonderful to get to know some of those people. Right now, I'd like to know if anyone has questions that you would have for any of the people on the panel. We'll entertain questions probably for the next 10, 15 minutes.
This is for Colonel Bailey. When you were serving stateside in the hospitals, I'm just curious, what was the race of the physicians you were working with? And or your other fellow workers in the hospital, the people who were administering the hospital, cleaning, supporting you in the hospital as a nurse?
Colonel Bailey.
Yeah, I didn't quite hear it all. Would you repeat it?
My main question is, were you working with black physicians or were you working with white physicians when you were in the hospital?
Thank you, I got it. For the first year, I guess I would say they were black physicians because in terms of the discrimination, they said black physicians and black nurses. It was a whole black unit. We were not integrated. Then as time passed, and when we lived separately, then we began to be integrated in the working situations, and then you had black and white physicians.
Thank you, Margaret.
And it was a progress, and we finally made it. But and as I should say, those people whom we worked and we became integrated were real happy to see us. We could have been integrated much earlier when it comes to people, but I guess the rules tell you that you must do it this way, and that is the way it was done.
I just want to make one comment about what they called the shortage of nurses that occurred in late 1944. And actually, I don't think most people know this, there was a bill to draft nurses, and it passed through the House of Representatives in March of 1945. And here we had black nurses and male nurses who they wouldn't accept either. Well, it went to the Senate, the bill did, and by the time it got to the Senate, Germany surrendered in May. And there really wasn't a lack of nurses. They were volunteering. The Army kept moving the numbers around without telling the Red Cross. And the Red Cross was the body that recruited the nurses and screened them prior to their going into the Army and Navy. And it seemed so unjust to me when I researched that to find out that these nurses were working so hard over there, and yet the group were kind of being blamed for not stepping up to the plate, and indeed they did by the thousands. Any other questions?
Uh-oh, you have to wait. You got to get the microphone. I have a question for Ms. Visser.
Yes.
My father graduated from medical school in '43, so he was a doctor stateside. He took care of a lot of burn patients at Valley Forge, and he never told me a lot about what they did there, but he said when MASH came out, he said they were a lot like that. They used to work hard and play hard because of what they saw, what they witnessed, and I'm sure what y'all saw was so much worse than what my father saw stateside. Tell me what y'all did after hours. Were y'all kind of like those MASH doctors and those nurses? Did y'all cut up a lot because of what you saw, you know, you had to cut loose and let go of that. Did you?
I don't think we had as much fun as they had on MASH.
Hi. For the two of you who were serving overseas, did either one of you have any trouble readjusting to life back in the States?
Any trouble adjusting to life that if they get back home?
Agnes, would you like to take that question?
What is that?
About your,
What did she say?
she wanted to know if you had any trouble adjusting after you got back to the United States.
Not particularly. I think I wasn't gone long enough. Yeah, one thing that confused me was some of the songs I'd hear on the radio. I thought I certainly haven't been gone long enough for the language to change. Like Mersey Dotes and Dozy Dotes. I had to listen to that over and over again. No, I don't think I had too much trouble adjusting. I was glad to be back, and I was glad to be over there, too.
All right. This is not really a question. As a nurse who went to school 15 years after you did, I guess it is a question because do you know how much we appreciated what you had done for nursing ahead of us? You served as our role models. You set an example for us. You accomplished things that showed the independence of nursing that had never been accomplished before. And so you've set a framework for those of us who went on to become nurse practitioners and receive doctorates in nursing. And I just want you to know how much we appreciate it.
Thank you.
This question is for Virginia. Ma'am, did you have access to like penicillin and some of the other wonder drugs that were coming out at about that time? And you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. First time I ever used penicillin was right before I went into the Army, and a young boy had a ruptured appendix, and the Army flew in penicillin. We had to mix that each time. The vials had to be mixed. And that was very rare because the Army wasn't releasing that. It was rare that we received that. But we gave penicillin, yes, overseas, all the time. We had access to penicillin. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
I had two questions to all the panel. How did you all take care of the shell shock or the people that were stunned? Or there's a story about Patton getting upset with one soldier who was sad or depressed. How are these patients taken care of? And the second question is, how are people who had hepatitis or had some other medical illness, how are they taken care of and then returned to the battlefield if they were well enough?
Well, our patients that we had that were treated, they tried to get them back on the line as quickly as possible. And the patients that we had that, I can't remember the first question you asked, that suffered from, what'd you ask, shell shock, as we call it. Those patients were usually sent back home as quickly as possible if they could get, because we really didn't have the facilities to take care of them. At least that was the case in the hospital in which I served, in the 187th General, before I went to the continent. But those patients were taken back to the States as quickly as possible.
I could speak to the early part of the war on that. The battle fatigue or neurosis. And in the Mediterranean theater of war, it was really the learning curve for medicine and nursing. And there was a Captain Hansen, who was a psychiatrist, who was assigned in the Mediterranean theater to experiment to figure out how to deal with a shell-shocked soldier's heart. You know, it's been in every war that we've had. And so what he did in that case, in his experiments, he would, they'd take the soldier and give them a lot of barbiturates. They'd get them up enough to feed them and toilet them. Then they would give them barbiturates again, and for a couple of days they would just rest, but they weren't far behind the lines. And then the one nurse we interviewed told us that this was in the Mediterranean, that she assigned her best-looking, gorgeous nurse to this group of patients. And so this woman was not afraid when the bullets were flying. This was in Tunisia, and the bombs were dropping. These guys would wake up and see this red-headed nurse who did have no fear, and they were well rested after that. And many of them could go back back to the lines. But Virginia's right. If they really had a bad case, they couldn't. Dr. Baumgartner?
Yes. When I was at Cushing General Hospital, there were some wounded 29th Division men, and some of them, they weren't called shell shock, they were battle fatigue. They locked them up in a ward, in like a prison, and they marched them around, and some of them were in bad shape because they were not with it. But the best thing I found out is if you had a bad dream, you didn't tell anybody about it, because they put on your record that you were psycho, you know, or Section 8 they used to call it. It would ruin your whole future career. So I kept quiet. If I had a bad dream, I didn't tell anybody.
Being a psychiatric nurse, we did receive quite a few patients back, and I'm pleased to say that we treated them well in the Army. I would prefer being treated in the Army as a psychiatric patient because we did a much better job. I had a chance to visit a civilian hospital, and I saw them sitting in the corners and nobody doing anything for them. So the Army did a fine job of treating those patients when they returned to the States, because we had hospitals that were designated as the hospitals to treat those patients.
I have a question about, you read a lot about that, especially near the end of the war in the winter, December of '44, about the incidence of trench foot and how serious that was and how it was dealt with.
Anybody deal with it?
Don't know that one.
Well,
Trench foot was very bad. The people, especially the Band of Brothers, they were out in the snow in one of the places. I think it was a place called Marketplace. They had to change their socks very often because the dampness got to their feet. And a lot of these people couldn't walk too good. They had the toes amputated, so it was a serious thing, especially at Bastogne, where the Battle of the Bulge.
We didn't see many patients that had so-called trench foot, but because we were a surgical hospital, so those patients were sent on to other hospitals. I don't recall seeing any that, some of them had some difficulties walking with their feet, but that wasn't primarily what they were there for. They were for surgical reasons.
I had mentioned the learning curve that occurred in the Mediterranean theater, and that was one thing we saw in the Mediterranean was trench foot, because of places like Anzio, Beachhead, and places that had water that was standing, and the soldiers would be in the foxholes and they would get trench foot. And they figured out how to deal with it then, was teaching them to take care of it. It was foot hygiene and dry socks and all. But it didn't translate to the European theater. It was one of the learnings that did not translate. And we went through the same thing again with the problem of trench foot. And it put thousands of soldiers, took them off the line. It was a very serious problem. That was a good question.
I had a question. I hope nobody had a flashback. I'm off on your far right. I hope nobody had a flashback with the ambulance drive-by a minute ago. I'm wondering, could y'all speak a moment to what kind of triage took place with some seriously wounded when they arrived at an evac, and particularly those patients that it was deemed, they were deemed not going to be able to make it, and so it was kind of like a hospice situation. Could any of y'all speak to that?
We didn't, the patients that we had that came back, so many of those were not, they were sent way back if there were problems. We dealt with the ones that had to be operated on at that time, and with the surgical, and we really were supposed to be a chest hospital, but we received all sorts of patients after D-Day because the rate of patients coming in was so great that we took care of whatever there. But we didn't, as I said before, medical issues were sent to other hospitals. Does that answer your question?
Dr. Baumgartner, go ahead.
On the LST that I landed in Portsmouth, England in, they moved us all into the garage of this huge LST, and the medical officers walked down the line of the stretchers. And the British, he pointed his swagger stick at me, and they put you wherever they thought the best place to treat you was.
Well, I think various hospitals in England, some were assigned as chest hospitals, so they tried to get the patients when they came back. This was the beginning, when they first came back after D-Day, to try and get them to sort them out, triage them, so that they got to the correct hospital. Now, this wasn't always possible, but that was the goal, to get them to the hospital. If it was a chest hospital, whatever, you know. Burns, we did have some burns, a number of them that were very bad, but they were handled very quickly there.
Okay, well, thank you. We're out of time, and thank you very much to the panel and to the audience.